At 30, Sydnie Christmas finally said the quiet part out loud, and in doing so, she shattered the illusion millions of viewers had been clinging to since the moment she stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage. From the first soaring note, people sensed something different. This wasn't a hopeful teenager chasing a dream. This was a woman singing like someone who had already lost one. The confidence, the control, the raw ache behind every lyric, it all felt too lived in to be accidental. Viewers whispered the same thought online. She's been here before, and she's running out of time. What no one saw was how close Sydnie was to walking away forever. Behind the standing ovations and viral clips was a performer exhausted by rejection, bills, and the terrifying realization that talent alone doesn't guarantee survival. She had trained, worked, waited only to watch doors stay shut. By the time she auditioned, she wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing proof that her years of sacrifice hadn't been a mistake, and now she's admitted it. The fear, the doubt, the sense that this was her last real shot before the world moved on without her. The suspicion fans had that her voice carried the weight of someone who had already been broken wasn't wrong. It was the truth she'd been living. With every single day, this wasn't the beginning of Sydnie Christmas's story. It was the moment she refused to let it end. Long before the lights of Britain's Got Talent ever found her, Sydnie Christmas was already learning how silence could be louder than applause. The kind of silence that follows another unanswered audition email. The kind that settles in your chest when you start calculating your age not in years, but in chances left. By her late 20s, Sydnie wasn't dreaming anymore, she was surviving. Singing hadn't failed her, but the world around it had grown brutally honest. Talent, she learned, was never enough on its own. She had done everything right. Years of vocal training. Theater work that paid just enough to keep hope alive, but never enough to call success. Day jobs that drained her voice and her spirit, leaving her to rehearse late at night when exhaustion felt permanent. Friends moved on. Some gave up. Others settled. Sydnie smiled through it all, telling herself that tomorrow might be different. Even as doubt crept closer with every passing birthday. By the time she considered auditioning for Britain's Got Talent, desperation had replaced excitement. This wasn't about chasing stardom, it was about answering a terrifying question she could no longer ignore. What if this is as far as I ever go? She knew how the industry worked. She knew what people thought of performers her age, still trying to make it. She also knew she couldn't live the rest of her life, wondering what would have happened if she hadn't tried one last time. Walking onto that stage, Sydnie carried more than nerves. She carried years of rejection stitched into her confidence. That's what the audience felt instantly, even if they couldn't explain it. Her voice didn't sound hopeful, it sounded experienced. It didn't reach for approval. It demanded to be heard. And the moment she sang, something unspoken passed between her and the crowd. This was not a beginner asking for a chance. This was a woman fighting to stay. Almost immediately, suspicion followed praise. Viewers began asking the same question in different ways. Who is she really? Why does she sound so polished? Why does her pain feel so real? Some called it unfair. Others called it staged. But beneath the noise was a simpler truth people were circling without realizing it. Sydnie Christmas wasn't pretending to be anything she wasn't. She wasn't an overnight discovery. She was proof of what years of trying can do to a person. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. Every round felt heavier than the last, not because of competition, but because of what losing would mean. Going home wouldn't just hurt, it would confirm her worst fear. That she had waited too long. That the world had already decided. She smiled for cameras, but privately she was wrestling with the possibility that this stage might be both her breakthrough and her goodbye. When Sydnie later admitted she had nearly given up before the show, it shocked fans, but only because they hadn't wanted to believe it. Deep down, they already knew. They heard it in the restraint of her performances, in the way she never overplayed emotion. This wasn't ambition screaming. This was resilience whispering, "Please let this matter." The criticism about her professional background cut deeper than she let on. Being labeled as someone with an advantage ignored the years she'd spent unseen, unpaid, and overlooked. Experience hadn't protected her, it had scarred her. It had taught her how easily dreams can fade if they aren't acknowledged. When she spoke out, her words weren't defensive. They were tired. Tired of having to justify why she deserved a chance like anyone else. By the time the public began to truly understand her story, Sydnie had already crossed an invisible line. She had stopped performing for validation and started performing for closure. Win or lose, she needed to know she had given everything she had left. That alone changed the way she sang and why people couldn't look away. This wasn't about talent being discovered. It was about a woman refusing to disappear quietly, and what came next would prove just how close Sydnie Christmas had come to losing it. All before finally being seen. After the applause faded and the headlines settled, Sydnie Christmas discovered something far more unsettling than criticism expectation. Overnight, she was no longer just another contestant fighting to survive the industry. She was a symbol. The late bloomer. The woman who proved it wasn't over at 30, and while the public celebrated that idea, Sydnie felt the weight of it pressing down harder with every performance. Because symbols don't get to fail. People do. Each new round on Britain's Got Talent brought louder praise and sharper scrutiny. Every note was dissected. Every expression analyzed. If she sang with power, she was accused of being calculated. If she sang softly, people questioned whether she was holding back. There was no room for imperfection anymore. The same experience that once kept her invisible was now being used as a weapon against her, reshaping her story into something easier to argue about than understand. What viewers didn't see was how deeply that narrative cut into her confidence. Sydnie had spent years being told she wasn't enough. Now she was being told she was too much. Too trained. Too prepared. Too real. It was a contradiction she couldn't escape. She wasn't allowed to be a beginner, but she wasn't forgiven for being a survivor either. And in quiet moments, that contradiction threatened to undo everything she'd built. Behind closed doors, the pressure manifested in ways she rarely spoke about. Sleep became restless. Performances replayed in her head long after the stage lights dimmed. She began questioning instincts she'd trusted her entire life. Not because she doubted her ability, but because she feared being misunderstood. The public didn't just want her voice anymore. They wanted a story that fit neatly into their expectations. And hers refused to behave. As the competition intensified, so did her awareness of time. Winning wouldn't just mean recognition, it would mean validation for every year she'd spent waiting tables, training and wondering if she'd missed her moment. Losing, on the other hand, felt unbearable. Not because of embarrassment, but because it would confirm the quiet voice she'd been fighting for years. The one that whispered she'd arrived too late. Sydnie began to realize that what frightened her most wasn't failure. It was returning to anonymity with the knowledge that she had been seen, and still not chosen. That kind of loss feels personal, final, irreversible. And yet, every time she stepped onto the stage, she pushed that fear down and sang anyway, not to impress, but to survive. The audience sensed the shift. Her performances grew more restrained, more deliberate. Not because she was holding back, but because she was protecting herself. Each song became an act of control in a process that felt increasingly out of her hands. This wasn't the carefree release people expected from a talent show. This was a woman navigating the fragile space between hope and heartbreak. When she later spoke about the emotional toll of the competition, her words carried no bitterness, only honesty. She admitted that the experience forced her to confront parts of herself she'd long avoided. The fear of being irrelevant. The shame of still wanting more. The exhaustion of constantly proving she belonged. These weren't things she could sing away. They followed her offstage into silence, yet something unexpected happened along the way. In the middle of all the pressure, Sydnie stopped chasing approval. Slowly, almost unconsciously, she began reclaiming her voice not as a product but as a truth. She wasn't there to convince the world she deserved success anymore. She was there to prove it to herself. That shift changed everything, because when a performer stops asking for permission to exist, the performance becomes impossible to ignore. And whether the judges realized it or not, Sydnie Christmas was no longer competing against others on that stage. She was confronting the version of herself that almost gave up. And in doing so, she was about to face the most defining moment of her journey, one that would determine not just how the world saw her, but how she saw herself when the curtain finally fell. By the time Sydnie Christmas reached the final stretch of Britain's Got Talent. The fear she'd been running from finally caught up with her. Not fear of the stage, but fear of what would happen after it. For years the struggle had been clear: get noticed or disappear. Now that she had been seen, the question became far more dangerous. What if this is the peak? What if the moment she'd waited her whole life for was already slipping through her fingers? Success, she learned, can be just as disorienting as failure. The attention came fast and loud, but it didn't come with certainty. Praise was everywhere, yet nothing felt guaranteed. Offers were vague. Promises were careful. Sydnie understood the industry too well to mistake applause for security. She had watched too many talented people shine briefly, only to fade once the cameras moved on. And she knew how unforgiving the world could be to women who didn't fit a neat, youthful narrative. On stage, she delivered everything she had left. But offstage, doubt lingered. She wondered if people were applauding her voice or her story. If the emotion they felt was admiration or simply sympathy for someone who'd almost missed her chance. That thought haunted her more than criticism ever had. She didn't want to be remembered as the woman who arrived late. She wanted to be remembered as the woman who arrived ready. As the competition neared its end, Sydnie became painfully aware of how close she'd come to never standing there at all. Just months earlier, she had been considering a life without this dream, one quieter, safer, and infinitely smaller. That realization sharpened everything. Every lyric felt like a confession. Every breath felt earned. The audience wasn't just watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing the result of a decision she'd almost been too tired to make. When the results were finally revealed, the moment didn't feel triumphant, it felt unreal. Whether it ended in victory or not, something inside her had already shifted permanently. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had proven to herself that her voice still mattered, that the years she'd spent waiting hadn't hollowed her out. They had carved her into something stronger. Later, when Sydnie finally spoke openly about what she'd suspected all along, that she had been dangerously close to giving up, her honesty struck a nerve. Not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. So many people saw themselves in that admission. The fear of time running out. The quiet shame of still wanting more. The exhaustion of pretending you're fine when you're not. Sydnie didn't dress it up. She didn't turn it into a victory speech. She simply told the truth. And that truth explained everything people had sensed from the beginning. Why her voice carried weight. Why her emotion felt restrained. Not desperate. Why she sang like someone who knew exactly what it cost to stand there. She hadn't come to Britain's Got Talent to chase fame. She came because she needed an answer, to know whether her dream was still alive or whether it was finally time to let it go. What she found wasn't just validation from judges or audiences. It was permission from herself to keep going. At 30, Sydnie Christmas didn't admit something trivial. She admitted something terrifying. That even with talent, even with experience, even with belief, the fear of failing never truly disappears. But neither does the fear of quitting too. Soon. Her journey wasn't about being discovered. It was about refusing to disappear. And now, with the world watching and her voice finally heard, Sydnie stands in a place she once thought she'd never reach, not free from doubt, but no longer ruled by it. Whatever comes next, one thing is certain. She didn't miss her moment. She survived long enough to claim it. After the final notes faded and the cameras shut down, Sydnie Christmas faced the quiet she had feared for years, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hollow silence of rejection or the numb stillness after another failed audition. It was a pause, heavy, honest, the kind that forces you to look at yourself without the noise of applause or doubt to blur the edges. For the first time in a long time, Sydnie wasn't asking what the world thought of her. She was asking what she believed now. The days after Britain's Got Talent were emotionally disorienting. Messages poured in from strangers who felt seen by her story. People older than her thanked her for proving it wasn't too late. People younger admitted they were terrified of becoming her until they heard her speak. The irony wasn't lost on her. The very fear that had haunted her for years had now become the reason others felt hope. That realization was overwhelming in a way no standing ovation could match. Yet beneath the support lingered uncertainty. Sydnie knew better than to romanticize momentum. She understood how quickly attention shifts, how easily the industry moves on to the next headline. The difference now was that she no longer tied her worth to its approval. That shift hadn't come from winning or losing, it came from surviving the truth. She'd finally allowed herself to say out loud. Admitting she'd nearly quit didn't make her feel weak. It made her feel honest. For years, she'd carried quiet shame about that exhaustion, as if wanting to stop meant she didn't deserve to want success. Speaking openly stripped that shame of its power. She realized that endurance, not confidence, had always been her greatest strength. The world just hadn't seen it until now. Looking back, Sydnie began to understand why people had suspected something deeper all along. Audiences don't always recognize technical perfection, but they recognize lived experience instantly. They hear it in restraint. They feel it in the spaces between notes. Her performances weren't polished because she was privileged. They were controlled because she'd learned what it felt like to lose control completely. The label of late success stopped bothering her. Late compared to whom? Everyone's timeline is a myth until you're trapped inside it. Sydnie now saw her journey not as delayed, but forged. Every closed door had given her emotional armor. Every year of waiting had given her perspective. She hadn't arrived late, she'd arrived ready. There were still fears, of course. Dreams don't become safe just because they're visible. But now, fear no longer dictated her decisions. She no longer sang to outrun time. She sang because it was the truest language she had. Whether stages grew bigger or quieter from here, her relationship with her voice had changed permanently. In interviews, Sydnie chose her words carefully, not to protect an image, but to protect others who might be listening. She didn't promise fairy tale endings. She didn't pretend persistence guarantees reward. Instead, she spoke about resilience, about redefining success when survival itself feels like failure. That honesty made her more than a performer. It made her a mirror. At 30, Sydnie Christmas didn't confirm gossip or silence critics. She confirmed something far more uncomfortable and far more human, that passion doesn't expire, but people do get tired. And being tired doesn't mean you're finished. Sometimes it means you're standing at the edge of a decision that will change everything. Her story wasn't about talent shows or trophies. It was about choosing not to disappear when disappearing felt easier. About stepping into the light not because you're fearless, but because you're done hiding. That's what audiences had sensed from the beginning. Not mystery. Not manipulation. Truth. And now, whatever comes next, Sydnie moves forward with something she never fully had before. Not certainty. Not guarantee as but peace.